Hi, I'm Stella O'Malley, a psychotherapist in Ireland.
And I'm Sasha Ayad, an adolescent therapist in the United States.
And this is Gender, a Wider Lens, a podcast dedicated to the shifting concepts around gender in our contemporary culture.
Through in-depth interviews, personal stories, and psychological exploration, we seek to open up the discourse around this hot-button issue.
Join us as we look at gender from a wider lens.
Howdy, Stella.
How's it going? How's life?
Life is going well, I have to say. It is summer and we're rocking and rolling with our amazing podcast guests. And today we had on Alex Byrne, and it was so great to talk to him. He wrote this amazing book, The Trouble with Gender, and we got to pick his brain. He's a philosopher, and he's done a deep dive into studying the concept of gender as it exists now, and gives us a bit of a history about the word and how it's used. And it's pretty remarkable to think back about how much this term has changed and all of the implications of that.
Yeah, in this episode, I think quite a few listeners will find that there's a few myths that need to be maybe debunked or certainly explored. And Alex does a good job in exploring. And certainly the history of the word gender, I think there's a kind of a presumption that a lot of people are working on that isn't quite correct. And I think Alex gives a very good analysis of how that word came to be and how we are using it now. So it's really quite informative. Alex is evidently incredibly erudite. And his book is actually very witty, Trouble with Gender. It's a very witty, very interesting. He wears his learning lightly. And he's fun with the facts, but he does have an awful lot of information stacking up behind him.
Yeah. He also tells us about his critique of Jack Turban's new book, Free to Be. And Jack Turban is a really influential psychiatrist and writer and commentator who's often kind of sought out by the media to talk about gender distress in youth. And Jack Turban is one of these people who dogmatically supports the gender affirmation model in the face of contrary evidence. He tries to debunk anybody who kind of says otherwise. And so Alex recently wrote an article about Jack Turban's new book, and we kind of critique it and analyze it. And he tells us a little bit about his thoughts. And I think this is just really important because if you are trying to understand, how are people justifying these medical interventions for kids or this kind of radical social identity change for children so young? You can't really understand that unless you understand the affirmation model people such as Jack Turban and how they think and how they make sense of this. So Alex kind of takes us through that, and it was really interesting to talk about.
We first met Alex, he came to Denver and he gave a speech. And do you remember he gave his book to me and you? And he had a pink ribbon around yours and a blue ribbon around mine because I was gender non-conforming as a child. So there's a funness to this episode that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, he's fun.
But another thought-provoking element of today's episode was Alex, his analysis of John Money and his kind of the way he thought about gender identity. And, again, you could say that there's certain kind of truths that are being presumed to be true. And especially, let's say, now that this movement that we're in is growing and kind of, getting legs, there's an awful lot of things that have to be explored and re-explored. And, how gender identity could be perhaps socialized in some people. He talks about that, and he really does go quite into it. So that was certainly very interesting. As well as that, in the bonus content, he talks about philosophy and how there's different schools of philosophy. And in the feminist school of philosophy, there was kind of maybe a less open to critique, that there was a certain presumption of truths when you're in the feminist school of philosophy that isn't necessarily so in other schools of philosophy. That was news to me. I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah, it really surprised me to talk about this idea that maybe you could raise a kid by a different gender identity and all might go fine. I mean, I think it was like a thought experiment that Alex took us through in the episode and in the bonus content, that feminist philosophy has a worldview built into it, which makes it very resistant to analysis and critique. So that was really interesting. And, to say a little bit more about Alex, he's a Lawrence R. Rockefeller Professor of Philosophy at MIT. And he's the author, as we said, of The Trouble with Gender, Sex Facts, Gender Fictions, and it was published in 2024. So it was a really interesting conversation with Alex Byrne. Before we dive into the conversation, we want to take a quick moment and thank our sponsors, GenSpect and Therapy First. GenSpect is an international organization committed to fostering a healthy approach to sex and gender. GenSpect will be hosting the Bigger Picture Conference in Lisbon, Portugal this September. To learn more about who will be speaking at the conference and to order your tickets, visit genspect.org.
Therapy First is a non-profit worldwide professional association of mental health providers who view psychotherapy as the appropriate first-line treatment for gender dysphoria. Therapy First supports psychotherapists working with gender dysphoric youth and young adults and offers public education on mental health and psychotherapy. Visit therapyfirst.org to learn more.
Now here's the conversation. Hi, Stella and Alex. We're so glad to have you. Welcome.
Thanks very much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And, just before we started the podcast, I was discussing, sex and gender and what an extraordinary passionate subject it is for so many people. And when I first got involved with the sex and gender wars, for want of a better phrase, my understanding of it was that sex was, male or female, and that gender was masculine or feminine, as a rule of thumb that you could kind of run with that. And I that didn't make me collapse in a heap and want to start squealing. But I soon found out when I joined the merry-go-round of Twitter that actually this is actually a terrible thing to say. And yet it's actually kind of for me, it's a very useful distinction. There's sex, so therefore there can be, a boy can be born a male and yet he can be feminine. So there's sex and gender. So there's a boy and he's a feminine boy or a masculine girl. And arguably, there is a need for a differentiation between the word sex because, two people having intercourse versus gender if you wanted to talk about two different kind of gendered behaviors, masculine or feminine or whatever. And I know I can hear people from the future squealing at me that there's no such thing as gendered behavior. But I would argue, and I'm sure Alex is going to educate us on whether there is or there isn't. So I suppose what I wanted to know, there was a reason why we called our podcast Gender a Wider Lens, not Sex a Wider Lens. There's a reason why, we called the organization I'm in, which is GenSpect, not SexSpect. And you called your book Trouble with Gender, not Trouble with Sex. And I think all three of those examples were appropriate, if you follow me, that we were speaking about gender rather than sex. So all those people who run after me saying sex not gender aren't actually correct. No, I've unleashed the dogs of war here, but you tell me, where am I wrong with all of that, Alex? Because you're Mr. Gender.
You're not really wrong. It's just that, one problem, or maybe the chief problem, is that the word gender is just used in this multiplicity of ways. So, as you pointed out, on one use of gender, it means masculinity or femininity. And I think that goes back to the psychiatrist Robert Stoller and his book Sex and Gender in 1968. And there Stoller defined gender as the amount of masculinity or femininity found in a person. That was actually not very helpful because it sounds like on that usage, you should be able to, ask Sasha, just how much gender do you have exactly? Because, gender seems to sort of come in degrees, just as masculinity.
In milliliters, or is it percentages?
Right, well, exactly there. Then there's the question
pounds of gender?
Of the units, yes. How do you, So anyway, that's one usage of gender. And as you pointed out, Stella, of course, it is absolutely crucial to distinguish sex from masculinity and femininity. Mm-hmm. Of course, there can be, femininity generally goes along with the female sex, but of course it doesn't always. And, butch lesbians are in many respects masculine, even though they're female, and similarly for, feminine boys and so on. So there's definitely a distinction here. But then other people use the word gender to mean sex-typed social roles or expectations attaching to the male sex or the female sex, which is a bit different from masculinity and femininity. And other people use gender as an abbreviation for gender identity. And yet other people use gender as an abbreviation for the categories man and woman, boy and girl. And if you use gender in that way, you normally think that like being female or being an adult human female and being a woman can come apart. There could be male women or adult human females who are not women. And then, okay, so on the one hand, we've got all this ambiguity. But then to make matters even worse, there is an established use of the word gender, which is perfectly familiar when you start looking for it, which goes back in English, I think, to the 15th century, on which it just means sex.
Mm-hmm.
And that sense of the word gender is actually very useful. Mm-hmm. And you yourself, Stella, illustrated why it's so useful. I myself would be very interested in a podcast called Sex, a Wider Lens, but I would sort of naturally interpret that in the intercourse sense. So
that's what I said. That would take us into a very different realm.
That's right.
Or sex.
So it is. So I think it's a plausible conjecture that gender as a synonym for sex, as a synonym for sex in the sense of male and female, became much more popular in the 60s and later because people wanted to talk about sex in the sense of intercourse much more than they did.
Exactly.
compared to Victorian times. So it was very useful to have this word which disambiguated the word sex. So you have this, as I see it, you have this understandable linguistic pressure to have a word which disambiguates sex, which means male and female, and that's one sense of the word gender. That's just not going away. So if you want to make some of these other distinctions, like the distinction between male and female and masculinity and femininity, it's just going to add to the confusion or just create unnecessary confusion if you use the word gender to mark that distinction. So my own view is that just as a sort of prescriptive matter, unless you want to like confuse everyone, you should only use the word gender to mean sex, as in male and female. If you want to talk about gender roles, you can use the expression gender roles. If you want to talk about masculinity and femininity, well, we have those two words right there. I mean, I don't really see the need for a third one. If you want to talk about gender identity, then use the phrase gender identity.
But if you're using the word transsexual, you could argue that word doesn't fly, because if a transsexual is somebody who is trying to change their sex, and that's not actually possible. But if you use the word transgender, you could say, well, arguably that does actually work, because you could change your gender role presentation, but you still you've retained your sex.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like being a little sort of over literal. Exactly. I mean, people back in the day used to talk of sex change surgeries, where that was something of a metaphor. They didn't mean these surgeries literally changed people's sex from male to female, but they were, in some sense, a close approximation. So I'm not, myself, I wouldn't be too worried. Well, for a start, transsexual is totally out of favor anyway as a word, unfortunately.
Yeah, this is the premise of your book. Your book basically is one long argument to say that we should only use the word gender to mean biological sex, and that we should retain the word sex to indicate either biological sex or the act of sex, right? Is that kind of a fair summary of your thesis?
Yeah, I mean, that's in a way that's just a bit of ground clearing. So, the book isn't all. It would, I suppose, it would be an extremely boring book if it was how
it's
we
actually
should use
quite hilarious.
Maybe it's a boring book anyway, but
no, it's not. It's not. It's a funny book.
If we just use the word, if the whole point was we should only use the word gender to mean sex, but I really do think it has caused an enormous amount of confusion. And I mean, an example, I think we're going to get to this at some point, is actually Jack Turban's recent book, Free to Be. He uses the word gender in that book, but it's really very unclear what he means by it.
Yeah, I have not read the book yet. I don't think I can muster up the fortitude at the moment to read his book. But I would love to hear your take on it. Does Turban define, does he use the term gender interchangeably with some of the different meanings that we've covered so far, like as in gender roles or masculinity, femininity? Does he define that clearly anywhere? Tell us a little more.
No, I don't think so. So, I mean, the book's well worth reading. I mean, I think it really does give you an insight into, into the way Turban thinks of things, and it's quite. I found it
maybe
quite,
we can explain.
Can
you tell the world who Jack Turban is, just in case they don't know?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, Jack Turban, well known to listeners of your podcast, I'm sure, is of
Sex a Wider Lens, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, listeners of Sex.
Jack is a child and adolescent psychiatrist at UC San Francisco, and he's a colleague of Diane Ehrensaft, who, of course, is a major figure in the gender-affirming model
for
of
kids,
pediatric gender medicine. And Turban is very widely known for defending the current model of pediatric gender medicine as it's practiced in the United States. He often pops up on television or NPR. He had a piece in the New York Times recently. And so I can't think of any doctor in that area who's more prominent in the public arena than Turban. I don't know if you can, but he's more prominent, I think, than Ehrensaft, at least when it comes to television and writing op-eds and so on.
For sure.
Yeah, and then recently, since the Cass review, the final report of Hilary Cass's review came out in April, he has been an enthusiastic critic of that report. And I think he was one of the co-authors on this Yale white paper that came out recently, criticizing the Cass review. Anyway, so that's Turban, and he recently wrote a book called Free to Be, Understanding Kids and Gender Identity. And as I point out in my review, the title of the book appears to be a reference to the 1970s. I guess maybe, Stella, you won't remember this. I certainly didn't remember it because I wasn't in the US at the time, and Sasha, you're way too young. But in the 1970s, the early 1970s, there was this children's TV show and associated book called Free to Be. And you can see the TV series on YouTube. And it's all very ironic because the point of the old Free to Be was, boys can be anything. They can be like primary school teachers or cooks or stay-at-home dads or something. And girls can be firefighters or car mechanics. And there's one... So it came with a bunch of songs as well. And there's and little skits. And one skit is between two two babies. I can't remember what the skit is called exactly. But anyway, so these two babies are talking in the hospital. They're just like wearing diapers. They've only just been born. And they're wondering who is the boy and who is the girl. And first they try to do it by interests. But then they realize that this doesn't work. So they're still very confused about who is the boy and who is the girl. And they finally discover who is the boy and who is the girl when the nurse comes to change their diapers. And so they they see their genitals. But of course, the new free-to-be in the hands of people like Jack Turban is sort of exactly the opposite. That's exactly how you can't tell the difference between, it's like a rule of thumb for sure, but it is by no means definitive. And the little kid with the penis and testicles could very well be a girl, as a matter of fact. Anyway, but the funny thing is that Turban does not acknowledge that his title is a riff on the old free-to-be. It absolutely has to be. But anyway, there's a huge irony there.
The trans movement often do that. They are linguistically brilliant, I sometimes think. And they often take phrases from back in the day and rejig them. And so like they, born this way was a big kind of phrase in the 70s. That's right, yeah. And then they kind of just tweaked it to born in the wrong body. You know what I mean? There's been a lot of that sort of kind of, and I have to say that as far as branding, there's nothing beats that.
Yeah, Turban, interestingly enough, is also keen on the born this way narrative when it comes to gender identity, and spends a lot of time trying to argue that there's a very strong biological basis for transgender identities. But just to go back to the word gender, actually, maybe I should digress, because I do find this very interesting. So Jack...
can I make a quick comment?
Please,
the original show was called Free to Be You and Me.
That's
Jack,
right.
Jack shortened his book title,
That's right.
Free to Be.
Sorry.
I just got a note from our very smart producer who's Googling everything.
Yeah. Google correction. Okay, let's hope this kind of thing doesn't happen too frequently throughout this podcast. I'll try not to make any other serious mistakes. Yeah, so one thing that is quite fascinating is that, and here I'm not revealing any secrets because Turban is open about this on page 1 of the book. Turban himself is gay, and moreover seems to have had a very homophobic father, and just a very problematic childhood as a gay boy. And just anecdotally, gay men do seem to be overrepresented on the gender affirming team. But then if you look at the opposing team, those people who are inclined to say, this is all, homophobia, the whole gender ideology is basically homophobic and no kid is born in the wrong body and we're transing the gay away and so on. Gay men are also overrepresented on that team as well. There's a British screenwriter called Gareth Roberts who recently wrote a book called Gay Shame. He was a screenwriter for the British science fiction TV series called Doctor Who, which Stella will know. Yeah, right. So so Roberts wrote Gay Shame, and it's just interesting that in a certain respect, Roberts and Turban are both very similar. Both Turban for sure, probably Roberts had difficult childhoods coming out as gay and so on, and yet they've in later life. They've come to very, very different opinions. And I think, this is just my conjecture, but I sort of imagine that as a gay man, you could kind of look at the trans stuff in sort of two ways. You could either think, oh my goodness, that could have been me. If that had been me, I would have been trans and put on puberty blockers and whatnot. And then I would have been deprived the opportunity to be an intact, happy gay man as I am, or you can think, oh my God, I as a sexual minority growing up, I had this really tough time of it, And so my heart, and now I see these other sexual minorities. They're also having a tough time with it. So my heart goes out to them. I want to do everything I can to help them. And if you, sorry, Sasha, you're representing.
I think I agree so much. And I'm thinking about when myself and Dr. Zucker and Stephen Levine and Lisa Marciano gave a talk at the APA. There were so many people in the audience. I mean, first of all, we didn't know if anyone would come, but it was packed. And so many people came as representatives from gender clinics and so on and so forth to kind of speak after our presentation. It's a long story. I don't want to get into it. But there was a young man who got up who was some sort of psych resident. And he was saying, I am gay. And like when I was coming out or when I was questioning my sexuality, my parents wouldn't have known. And you guys are saying this is ROGD. How would a person know if their kid is this and that? So he projected his own experience exactly onto just a different type of distress. And I think what I'm hearing, and I think you're right, there's two ways you can look at it. And I think in the second way, the philosophy might be when a young person is having an inclination about their identity, regardless of whether it's a sexual identity or a gender identity, it is damaging to question that. I think that's the philosophical kind of common thread underneath those two positions.
I think that's right. I think that's right. And I think the way people like Jack kind of square this circle, or at any rate make their position much more palatable, is not to conceptualize the problem, the sort of medical problem as, okay, here we have a boy, that is a young male who is severely gender dysphoric. What is the best way to help him? You know, of course, the answer to that might be put him on puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones and surgery, maybe. But of course, as soon as you put it like that, the medical option sounds less plausible than if you put it in Turban's preferred way, which is that we do not have a boy here. Actually, we have a girl. We have a girl who is in a male body, and if you frame the situation that way, then of course you're not open to the charge that you're sending feminine gay boys down some medicalized pathway, because they aren't feminine gay boys. In fact, they are girls. Girls, admittedly, of an extremely unusual kind, but girls nonetheless.
Then it becomes girls with physical deformities rather than a healthy boy who is having distress.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. So I think that's why you get this sort of very different description of the patient population from someone like Jack compared to someone like Gareth Roberts, who would obviously describe these, the male kid as a feminine boy who's very likely to be gay, as opposed to a feminine girl in a male body who's very likely to be heterosexual.
Yeah.
Can I just continue with them?
Please.
Before I forget with... Oh, and then it would be good to talk about Turban and ROGD at some point, but just on the issue of the word gender. So Turban tries to explain what... So he tries to explain what gender identity is, and it turns out to be like extremely complicated. kind of
big shocker.
It's sort of very hard to understand. So on the one, it's got various layers as he thinks of it. So it's your relation to masculinity and femininity, and it includes or can include the way we feel about our bodies, but it has this central third component, which is a transcendent sense of gender. That's his phrasing. And that's the thing that's really doing... That's really the thing that's doing the work. That's the thing that explains why, let's say, a butch lesbian who finds masculine gender roles much more appropriate for her, and maybe doesn't really care for the fact that she has a female body or large breasts or something, but is nonetheless cisgender and not transgender. It's the transcendent sense of her own female gender that that makes her cisgender and not transgender, according to sort of Turban's theory. These other components kind of drop out, and really it's the transcendent sense of your own gender. Okay, so what does gender mean, though, in transcendent sense of your own gender? And it definitely doesn't mean sex, because Turban is, unsurprisingly, rather negative about sex. He thinks, oh, sex, male and female, it's like super confusing. Actually, he says something, in a way, something similar about sex to what I say about the word gender. It's like, oh, it's used in multiple ways. It's really best not bothered with. The one clear thing is that people are assigned a sex at birth, so we will just use sex assigned at birth as a replacement for sex. So let's just not call people male or female anymore. Let's just say that they were assigned, for some mysterious reason that he doesn't really explain, male or female at birth. So sex is out. Okay, so gender can't mean sex, but what does it mean in the phrase transcendent sense? Forget the transcendent thing, which is already a little murky. What does gender mean in the phrase transcendent sense of your own gender? And he never explains that at all. So in a way, I say this in the review, despite trying to explain, putting in a lot of effort to explain what it is to be transgender. So the explanation is all in terms of gender identity. Similarly with being cisgender, the crucial concept is having a gender identity that might or might not align with your sex body. Despite putting all this effort in, he doesn't really satisfactorily explain what it is to be transgender. So kind of the whole book, in a way, is like founded on this
transcendent
kind of confusion, or at any rate, something that's extremely underexplained.
It sounds, I mean, there's a part of me that, if I was to be very generous, it sounds quite appealing. It sounds like some mysterious knowledge that some people may have of something that sounds quite spiritual. It sounds kind of amazing. I mean, it reminds me of the kind of New Age movement when they talk about energy, right? Like, you know, tapping into your energy, but then they also liken it to like actual physics verified phenomena like sound waves and things like that. So, you know, it's interesting. Like, there's something about this transcendent sense of gender that, like, it does harken back to real things we know, like femininity and masculinity.
Yeah.
And maybe to biological sex, though he's throwing that out. But it sounds kind of like, I mean, I can imagine that if I was totally open-minded to this, I'd think, gosh, I'd love to know my transcendent sense of gender. Sounds amazing to know that. But obviously, it's the most confusing concept that is throwing everybody into major disarray.
Yeah. I mean, of course, the thing is that the transcendent sense of gender can't be this thing that only a few adepts or gender gurus have. This has to be, it's crucial that it has to be a universal possession, because the whole idea, I think, behind, you know, and it's totally understandable, behind the cis trans terminology is that it's just like sexual orientation, setting aside any asexual people. Everyone has a sexual orientation. The only difference between gay people and straight people is that their sexual orientation is oriented differently with respect to their own bodies. And so, of course, if you think of it like that, this normalizes homosexuality. You know, we heterosexuals can see that, oh yeah, homosexuals are just the same as the rest of us. They're not like weird in any way. They don't have some disorder or anything like that. It just so happens that their sexual orientation, if you like, matches their own bodies, whereas our sexual orientation, or we heterosexuals' sexual orientation doesn't match our own bodies. And then that something similar is supposed to be the same in the case of cis and trans people. Trans people are exactly like the rest of us. It's not that, they have some psychiatric condition or that they're
right.
Unusual in sort of anything more than, in something more than a merely statistical sense. Everyone has a gender identity, and for the most part, that matches the person's sex, but in a minority, it doesn't. And those are the transgender people.
I think that might be a lot of the issue, that there's been a shortening of the word gender identity to gender, when a lot of people have been using really what they wanted to talk about. Jack Turban and back in the day, John Money and Robert Stoller and whoever else. They were talking about gender identity, that there was this transcendent soul within you. And it kind of got merged, just like sex got merged with gender identity got merged with gender as well. Poor old gender.
Right.
Getting robbed everywhere.
Right.
And actually, had we stayed with the sense of gender identity, do you have a gender identity? I suppose in a way we might have clarified things a lot. I think when people start, kind of getting really upset with the use of the word gender, what they're actually upset with is the concept that we might have a gender identity within us.
That's right. No, I think that's right. I think that's right. And the funny thing is that when gender identity was first introduced in 1964 by Robert Stoller and Ralph Greenson, it was very well and very usefully defined as the sense of knowing to which sex one belongs. And as soon as you define it that way, you see, oh, right, yeah. So basically everyone does have a gender identity in that sense. And,
in that sense.
Well, that's kind of interesting. If you observe little children, they're not born knowing that they're male or female. That's something that they have to learn. And of course, psychologists have investigated how and when they learn it, and how their understanding of what it is to be male or female changes and deepens as they get older. And all this is very interesting and useful work. And in that sense, the notion of gender identity is perfectly respectable and almost indispensable. It's just that it's got twisted to mean something much murkier. So when people say, oh, I don't have a gender identity, they don't mean that they don't have a gender identity in the old Stoller Greenson sense. They mean something like, I don't have a sexed soul, or I don't have a transcendent sense of gender in whatever sense Turban has in mind.
Yeah, and I think it's an issue of directionality. And what I mean by that is, if somebody has, let's say, sex dysphoria, to use kind of old school terms, it could make sense almost as a metaphor to say that they have a cross-sex gender identity. But when you actually inject the word gender identity into the culture and you define it, and then people start to contemplate it, it can actually produce ambivalence or confusion or distress, because it's, of course, based on some stereotypes and some feelings of discomfort, right? That, like, if you took a person who had sex dysphoria, like that it really was just one of those extreme cases, of course, their dysphoria is going to be based on some stereotypes and the way they feel about their body. But if you reverse the direction and you start telling everybody, oh, this is what a gender identity means, what about your own? It can trigger really serious confusion. I genuinely think that is what's happening.
That's right.
And we hear stories about this, and that's part of how social contagion develops, is that you take a concept that has nuggets of truth for everyone, but you kind of expand them, or I don't want to say exaggerate them, but you emphasize them, or you ruminate about them. And then everybody all of a sudden is like, oh God, my gender identity. That's what I think
That's
has
right.
happened.
That's right. I mean, the thing about gender identity in the old sense is that you don't really need to ruminate on the question of what your gender identity is, because it's normally pretty obvious what sex you are. But yeah, I think you're right.
Some people are atypical, so they will ruminate because maybe from a very young age they're kind of presenting out of the norm, and so they are kind of naturally given to ruminating because people are noticing that you don't present in a sex typical way, and there are norms that have been established over the centuries, that more girls tend to play in one way and more boys tend to play in another way. That could be because of a lot of different reasons, but there are norms, and it's kind of handy to have language to describe the norms.
Right.
Yeah. This is such a fascinating conversation. Listeners often tell us they feel frustrated by the lack of nuance around this issue, and they feel afraid to speak their minds.
And they ask us how they can help to bring more clarity to this difficult topic at their workplace, in their kids' schools, or with their own friends and family. Well, here are 3 things you can do right now.
1. Follow. Wherever you're listening to this, take a second to click like, follow, or subscribe.
2. Share. Send this podcast to anyone who you think might appreciate it.
3. Join. Support our efforts by becoming a paid Substack supporter. Go to widerlenspod.com now to subscribe.
Now back to the discussion.
Just to clarify something about the original notion of gender identity, and that is the sense of knowing to which sex one belongs, or the conviction that one is male or female. Of course, that won't do to define what it is to be transgender, because this is my go-to example. Take the trans man Buck Angel. He is not shy. So he says it repeatedly that he's female. All that testosterone hasn't changed his sex. So he's still, he's as convinced that he's female as he ever was. So if you thought that to be transgender is to have a misaligned Stoller Greenson kind of gender identity, then he would not count as transgender. So that's why that's not suitable for that conception of gender identity is not suitable for defining what it is to be trans.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think is a good definition of trans, if you think that's even a valuable term?
Yeah, I think, well, this takes us into the transgender child and contentious notions like that. I mean, it's interesting that people are much more inclined, well, this is my impression anyway, people are much more inclined to deny that there's such a thing as a transgender child as they are to deny that there's such a thing as a transgender adult. So you might wonder, why is there, what exactly are they getting at when they insist, oh, there's really no child is transgender. I mean, I think transgender or transsexual is actually a very useful term if you use it properly, and I would just use it for someone who has transitioned because of gender dysphoria. These are the transgender or the transsexual people. And of course, if the child has socially transitioned, that is, in that sense, a transgender child.
But I guess people use the word, why they don't like trans kid or trans child is because they're seeing it imposed upon children who are, for want of a better phrase, gender non-conforming. And so they see it as an imposition.
Yeah, although, right. I mean, I think that, but don't they resist it because they think that there are no transgender children, in the sense of children who have a misaligned turban-style gender identity. Yeah, sure, there are dysphoric children, and there are dysphoric children who are socially transitioned, but they're not like fundamentally different in kind from other children. They're just less content with their sex bodies for one or another reason than other children, and this is not some essential or permanent trait of the child, because obviously if all you meant by transgender is, look, someone who has transitioned to relieve psychological distress, either an adult or a child, then someone who's currently transgender might later become cisgender. Right? You know, if the person detransitions, or if the socially transitioned kid becomes untransitioned during puberty or something. But of course, that is exactly what is not supposed to happen if you're on the turban side of things. It's
Turban
once
might
transgender,
say,
always transgender. Once, yeah.
I don't know, because I've heard Turban argue, and I can't remember exactly where, but something along the lines of, it's part of the journey, part of the gender journey.
Oh, yeah.
And, Turban and his colleagues also seem to think that, following the lead of the individual, whether it's a child or an adult, that is the kind of peak value, even if that changes and there have been permanent changes done to the body, because those are reflections of a previous state of gender, whatever that means. So I don't know if, does he believe?
Yeah.
I mean, he has a lot of contradictory beliefs, but I don't know if he believes once trans, always trans.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe you're right. I don't think he addresses this explicitly in the book. He does acknowledge
it's too inconvenient to talk about
gender fluidity, but of course it has to. But in order to justify drastic medical treatment, of course you have to be convinced that for this particular person, their gender identity is not going to change. If you thought that it could change later, then of course that's a huge red flag and a reason for not going down the medicalized pathway.
It kind of to call it, let's say, sex dysphoria or the sexed body, a problem with your sex body, isn't quite carrying the experience, because actually, when you talk to people who've often experienced what we now know of as gender dysphoria, very often it's the imposition of society's sex roles. It's the sex-based roles. It's the roles in society. It's the perception of how they are in society. And they want to be, it's an outward and it's an external role that they want to change.
It's the social dysphoria, quote unquote.
Yeah, that's right.
Social dysphoria doesn't either carry it. It's arguably gender. If you're going to do it, the old-fashioned understanding of gender is actually the word that carries it, which is the kind of the stereotypes that are often associated with male or female behavior, because it's not social in other contexts. That's too wide, if you follow me. It's a very specific to their sexed body social dysphoria. So you're going to have to go, sex stereotype based social dysphoria, or you could call that gender dysphoria. Right.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a huge social component to all this, which certainly varies from culture to culture. You remember that Paul Vasey's study of gender dysphoria in the Fa'afafine, the third gender in Samoa. And there was relatively little, in fact, hardly any gender dysphoria, I think, in the Fa'afafine. Sorry, these are essentially gay men who are identified as such as boys and then raised in some feminine gender role that Samoan society has carved out for them. fine meaning in the manner of a woman, although they don't think of themselves as women. And I think that illustrates that. I mean, that is a great illustration of the power of culture and how amazingly flexible human beings are as far as their gender role goes. So I remember Paul saying at some point, he's gay, that if he had been born in Samoa, he would have been a fine. So you can, and there aren't, or at least there weren't, supposedly, any gay men in Samoa. The fact is, you seem to be able to take a feminine gay boy and raise him as this third gender, and he'll be totally happy. Or alternatively, you could raise him. I mean, they don't have surgery; at least they never used to. Alternatively, you can raise him as a stereotypical Western gay man, and he'll also do extremely well. So, in a way, that's like another bit of evidence that we don't really have turban style gender identities. We're actually extremely flexible as far as gender roles go. Sometimes people say, and actually I think Turban says this in the book. I remember Julia Serrano, the trans activist Julia Serrano, saying something like this in her book, Whipping Girl, that look, you can bring out your own, if you're an ordinary cis person, you can bring your normally submerged transcendent sense of gender to the surface by imagining what it would be like to wake up in the body of the other sex. And what you're supposed to say is, oh gosh, what I'm supposed to say is, gosh, if I woke up in the body of a woman, I'd be like absolutely horrified. This would be really distressing. So this brings out that I have this sort of subconscious attachment to my own male body, and would be utterly repelled living in the body of the other sex. So so that's just a kind of counterfactual scenario in which I have sort of gender dysphoria because I wake up in the wrong body. Yeah. But in fact, that is completely wrong, I think.
Totally.
And if you ask people, just ask ordinary people, would you like to be in the body of the other sex for a day or something if it was entirely risk-free and no one would ever find out. I mean, lots and lots of people said, yeah, wow, yeah, that would be absolutely fascinating. Yeah,
I'd love to see what it's like.
Right, exactly. So,
wow.
And I think I recently wrote something about John Money, who's everyone's favorite whipping boy in this connection. I do think there's a fair bit of evidence that, I'm not saying this is a good idea, but you could take a perfectly ordinary boy and raise him as a girl, and if you did it properly, then he'd be a pretty masculine girl, but he'd probably do fine. Of course, he'd be sterile and whatnot. So, but
wait,
let's ignore that.
Do you really think that?
Yeah,
and with the influx of testosterone at 13 and.
Well, that is a further complication. Okay, that is an excellent question. So,
thank you for.
So first of all, you're probably thinking of the David Reimer case. Right, exactly. It's popularized in John Colapinto's 2000 book, As Nature Made Him. And this is supposed to be some crucial piece of evidence that this is actually used by people on the gender affirming side to argue that, well, look, everyone has this sort of innate gender identity, because look at David Reimer, born Bruce, relaunched as Brenda when his penis was burnt off in a botched circumcision. He tore his dresses off, had a terrible time, reverted to living as a man and committed suicide. Well, that's a kind of complicated case. We don't have to get into the details. But the fact is that there have been these other similar cases which have worked out fine.
I mean, DSD cases particularly kind of come to mind. I mean, doctors have had to make decisions on behalf of the baby with the family's kind of thought process together about how to raise a child with ambiguous genitalia. I mean, not saying it always works out, but I mean,
we don't know. We don't actually know how it was for those people. Like our level of research around those people, just because they lived as that doesn't mean that they happily lived as that, is it? Like the trans question.
Yeah, I mean, there was one case. Actually, this was investigated by Ken Zucker and Susan Bradley, of a male who similarly had some circumcision accident, who was reassigned female earlier than David Reimer. Reimer was reassigned female relatively late. And she was followed up like years later. And she was unsurprisingly a lesbian in a relationship with a woman. And again, not unsurprisingly, she had a masculine occupation. She was a long-distance truck driver. Mm-hmm. But there was no indication whatsoever that there was any gender distress. Just to go to Stella's point about male puberty. So, of course, there's all this fuss at the moment about these two boxers at the Olympics. Let's not. We don't know what conditions they have, but it's so. I think it's very unfair to, as it were, beat up or malign these particular individuals who, as far as I can see, have done really nothing wrong. And if there's anyone to be blamed, it's the International Olympic Committee. But they may well have a DSD called 5-alpha reductase deficiency, where the male fetus has this defect in an enzyme which is used to synthesize a very potent androgen called dihydrotestosterone from testosterone, and that's responsible for the development of male genitalia in the womb. So when these kids are born, they often have female or female-looking genitalia, and they're raised as girls. They're exposed to regular testosterone levels in the womb. They have testes later in life when puberty comes. So they're often raised as girls. At least in parts of the world where their condition is not caught early. And when puberty comes around, you get this massive burst of testosterone from the testes, and that is like sufficient to masculinize, at least to some extent, the genitalia. And so the condition is often called penis at 12 because, what appeared to be a clitoris turns out to be a penis. And, they get some facial hair. It's a bit sparse because DHT is involved in facial hair. But they develop physically like males. Okay, so they essentially go through a male puberty. And a number of people with 5-alpha reductase compete in the women's category in sporting events. The most famous example is Caster Semenya. She has 5-alpha reductase. So, she's not a woman with high testosterone. She's a male with male levels of testosterone. Okay, but then, just to go back to Stella's point. So Semenya is an example of someone with 5-alpha reductase who went through male puberty and had this huge burst of testosterone during puberty, but who stuck with the female assignment. And if you look at what people with 5-alpha reductase do, when they go through puberty, some switch. They switch over to male and start living as men, but others don't. Some non-negligible proportion, 40% or whatever, stick with the female assignment because
I'd love to interview
because they just got used to it. They just got used to
Well,
it.
I actually wrote a long Twitter thread about this because, I mean, I saw a lot of people, and I don't know everything, obviously. I mean, I just want to disclaimer this. But I saw all these people saying, you're just a man who's a cheater who likes to beat up women, and the country of Algeria is covering this up, and all these. And then they brought in religion and Islam, and I mean, they just kind of went crazy. And I wanted to just, I mean, I tried to translate a bunch of Arabic language videos because I'm studying Arabic. I speak Arabic marginally with my tutor. And my understanding is that really this person grew up absolutely raised in the role of a female. And in the Arab world, those are not flexible roles. So it's almost unthinkable in a conservative Muslim country where gender roles are quite polarized, all of a sudden at puberty to say to your whole society, which will ostracize you immediately, oh, sorry, our daughter's really a boy now. I mean, the likelihood of that being a reasonable outcome is so astronomically low. I mean, that's just so impossible conceptually, I think. Not saying it isn't possible, but it's just very unlikely. So I just felt so terrible that this individual, I think the IOC should not have allowed them to fight in the women's category, but it was really disturbing to see the personal attacks as though this is an explicit manipulator who just wants to bend the rules to beat up women. I mean, I just thought that was such an unfair categorization or characterization.
Yeah, no, you just gave one reason why someone with 5ARD who would otherwise be inclined to switch from male to female around puberty wouldn't, because of social ostracism. But I'm pretty sure there are people with 5ARD who stick with the female assignment, not because to switch would invite ridicule or shaming or anything like that, but just because that's what they got used to. I mean, this is the relevant data point when we think about social transition. And, it certainly looks like it's a very plausible conjecture that socially transitioning children makes it much harder for them to
pull back,
to revert to living as their natal sex. But that's sort of exactly what you would expect if you just looked at the 5-alpha reductase data. You just get used to it.
Yeah.
And it's so much of a wrench to start living as the other sex.
In fairness, the social bridge would be so hard. That's why I'd love to interview anybody with 5-alpha reductase, because I don't know how you could do it in almost, maybe you could in San Francisco, but there's so few societies that you could say at 12, oops, I'm a boy, I thought I was a girl. It's a devastating event in a kid's life.
I see what you're saying, but look how easily people are transitioning their children who are typical in sexual development.
I
hear what you're
wasn't
saying,
in
but
the
I
trans
actually
phenomenon of the last 10, 15 years. I'm just saying up until
then. You mean
then,
before that? Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and
sure.
just psychologically, I was born this, but now I'm this. I just cannot imagine how hard that must have been.
Yeah.
These days, obviously, it's very different. It
Well,
would go under
certain
the trans
places,
umbrella.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'd love to ask you something else, Alex, before we wrap up the main part of our conversation. You touched on something very interesting in your book that got me thinking about, sometimes when we talk about drag queens, for example, people say that they are putting on woman face, kind of in reference to wearing quote blackface. And of course it is said that these are males who are using stereotypes to impersonate women, and some women find it very, very offensive. On a visceral level, I have never found it offensive personally. So I'm always curious when people do have very strong reactions to drag queens. But you talked about how there was like a sociologist called Fred Whitman, I think, in your book. And he pointed out... Frank Whittam. And he pointed out that drag appears spontaneously, predictably, and indigenously in different cultures. And I thought that was interesting, and I hadn't really thought about that.
No,
Can you say
it's not
more?
necessarily, you said as well in the book, it's not necessarily woman face. There's a way to look at it in a different way. That's how I perceived it.
Right. I mean, obviously there's a difference between, I mean, maybe this is why some women get offended by drag, because it's not exactly female impersonation. I mean, there are female impersonators, I mean, like, I don't know, Dame Edna Everage, for instance. But they're not kind of caricatures of, well, I suppose Dame Edna is something of a caricature, but they're not caricatures of womanhood in the way that drag is a caricature of womanhood, a sort of super hyper exaggerated kind of femininity. And I can completely understand why some women bridle at that. But yeah, it's I mean, I think it just shows, or that is the popularity of drag worldwide, where it doesn't seem to have originated from a single source. It's just something that feminine gay males sort of naturally glom onto. Does show that, contrary to what people like Judith Butler say, that masculinity and femininity are not these ephemeral, contingent cultural phenomena that just differ wildly from place to place. You know, there is such a thing as sort of true and abiding femininity and masculinity that's found in males and females all over the world, and gay men are just a particularly nice example of that.
And women don't necessarily own femininity, and men don't own masculinity.
No, that's right. That's right.
That's very liberating.
Yeah, I mean, more needs to be. I wish I'd talked about this more in the book, but yeah, a lot more needs to be said about what masculinity and femininity are exactly, and what the roots of masculinity and
might we talk about that?
I mean, there is this. Yeah.
Might we talk
there
about
is
that
this
in our
strand
exclusive bit, because that's fascinating. Masculinity and femininity. It's fascinating.
I mean, you know, there is this strand, obviously, in second wave feminism, which was definitely in a way coming from a good place, because, you know, women. It was very difficult for women to enter certain professions, and, you know, their occupational opportunities were a lot more constricted than they are now. It was this tendency to say that masculinity and femininity are just these sort of entirely superficial cultural overlays and have nothing to do with how men and women are naturally. It's just like, you know, dressing boys in blue or girls in pink. It could so easily have been the other way around or something. It's really just entirely arbitrary. But but I think it is far from arbitrary.
Before we go into our exclusive content, are there any books, movies, podcasts, anything interesting you've been consuming? I hate that word, but consuming media that you want to share with our audience? It could be gender related or totally ungender related. And Stella usually jumps in to say, or gender related at this point.
Right. Oh my God, no, this is, I wish you had...
Before we started recording,
I wish you had prepped me.
I don't like to prep people on that one, because I want to get
spontaneous.
The spontaneous one, because I think it's more interesting.
And Alex told us that most of that behind him is actually just wallpaper that looks like books. It's not real books.
Yeah. What have I been reading?
Jack Turban.
Recently. I've been reading Jack Turban. No, I just picked up Dorian Coleman's book on sex and gender, which I'm enjoying reading.
Oh, I feel like I've heard of. Who is Dorian Coleman?
Well, Dorian Lamberley Coleman. She is a professor. I think she's a law professor.
Oh, she wrote that Quillette piece, didn't she?
Yeah, she recently had a very good Quillette piece about DSD athletes. Anyway, so I'll give a shout out to that book. You should have her on the pod sometime.
We would love to. Yeah, we will try to make that happen.
Yeah, no, she seems to be extremely sensible.
Yes, that's lovely. Well, Excellent. Thank you, Alex.
We do that. Thank you for that, because we really do. Now that DSDs have become so controversial, and they always have been, it would be nice to do quite a bit around it. I think just to
for sure.
I think so, because it's just a very, very misunderstood and misrepresented conditions that I think really deserve a lot of attention.
I think that's a good point.
Right.
Well, thank you, Alex. For this portion, we'll let you go, and then we will see you over in the exclusives. Thank you. It's so nice to talk to you.
Thanks so much.
It's great.
Thanks for joining us this week on Gender, A Wider Lens.
If you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify.
And be sure to visit us on Substack by going to widerlenspod.com. There you can join our listener community, access bonus content and resources, plus learn about additional ways to support the show.
Our discussions are for educational purposes and are not intended as a substitute for mental health services.